So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to So Help Me Pod, a podcast concerning the American presidency and the theologies of the men who have served in that office. My name is Rob Lee, and my co-host Scott Lee, my younger brother, is here with me to talk about the American presidents, specifically today, our nation's 20th president of the United States. President James Abram Garfield served as the 20th president of the United States of America, and his term spanned only 199 days, cut short by an assassin's bullet and overzealous doctors. We'll get into that in a second, though. The president should be known not only, for his 199 days in office, but for his vibrant faith and fastidious service to our country in the House of Representatives for almost 20 years, spanning from 1863 to 1880 before he was elected to the presidency. This was already after being the principal of a school and general in the United States Army for the northern states during the American Civil War. The recent preeminent biography by C.W. Goodyear has catapulted President Garfield back into the spotlight even over 140 years after his death. Interestingly enough, I wasn't going to include President Garfield in this work of 12 presidents who should be explored for their faith and their American policy and their foreign policy and their domestic policy based on the fact that he only served 199 days. But after reading C.W. Goodyear's book, I really felt it important to include him and to talk about him and what he meant for our country and for the future of our nation even still. President Garfield was born in the 1830s in a log cabin in the western frontier of the Ohio country. It would turn out he would be the last president to be born in a log cabin. He lost his father by the time he was 2, and that ended up having him live with his mom and older siblings as they tried to make a way in the Ohio country. He would grow to his teenage years where he would steer canal boats for money and for his education. This imagery of a man steering canal boats in his prepubescent and pubescent years would be a presidential campaign tactic to portray a politician Garfield steering the ship of state safely through the canal of the Republic. As Garfield grew, he started to yearn for things more outside of Ohio, even serving, though, in the Ohio state legislature. After the breakout of the Civil War, the nation's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, would issue a muster for troops to aid the cause of the Union. James Garfield was a member of the Ohio legislature at the time and considered the war a crusade against the evils of slavery. This would make him unique in the pantheon of presidents as someone who condemned slavery even before he was in federal office. He was quick to enlist and wanted earnestly to serve. Garfield quickly rose through the ranks to brigadier general, where he would command the army, the 20th Brigade of the Army of the Ohio. He would participate in many consequential battles, including Chickamauga. Toward the middle of the war, it would become apparent of the public's desire to send General Garfield to the House of Representatives to represent part of Ohio after a redistricting of his area. General Garfield was reticent to serve as a member of the Ohio delegation because he felt the optics of it would appear, at least, that he might be judged harshly for leaving military service for federal service. He won his election, though, by a landslide after consenting to be considered. But also he lost his young daughter right before he was sworn in. Even the religious stalwart, he wondered aloud if this was punishment for leaving the battlefield of the Civil War. James Garfield, now a representative, favored the abolition of slavery, which caused him to be considered a radical Republican. The caucuses of the Republicans felt that there was no place for compromise or consensus building on this issue. These radical Republicans felt there was no question in their hearts or minds slavery had to be abolished totally, finally, forever. Representative Garfield was integral in the first ever impeachment of the United States of president after the war. He worked to bring about swift charges against President Andrew Johnson, the nation's 17th president, for his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. President Johnson, though, would be impeached in the House of Representatives, would ultimately be acquitted in the Senate. During the subsequent presidency of his former military commander, General Ulysses S. Grant, and our president that we have since mentioned on this podcast, Garfield drew distant from his former military boss due to massive government and bureaucratic corruption. Garfield would go on to be a bargain candidate. No one really even considered him an option until the very last minute for president, as Grant and others sought the presidency for themselves. Elected in 1880, the 20th president would begin his term in March of 1881. President Garfield would fall victim to an assassin's bullet on July 2nd, 1881, after the assassin failed to be appointed to a federal post. He had supported the wrong candidate in the Republican Party and ended up losing that appointment that he wanted. President Garfield felt no reason he should be offered security protection as president, and that ultimately was his undoing. Garfield was struck with 2 shots, one in the arm and one that came to rest in his abdomen. While many doctors and aides, and even Thomas Edison, rushed to the side of the ailing president of the United States, many now consider that to be his undoing. A lack of sanitary care for tools and digits, along with the incessant attempt to find the bullet in the body with their fingers even, was what led to President Garfield's death rather than the initial bullet itself. Had President Garfield been shot and alive today, he would likely have survived. Though there's no guarantee, obviously, it just seems like based on medical advancements and sanitary conditions, we would be able to keep him alive. President Garfield would die on September 19th, 1881, going down at the time of his recording as being the president who served the second shortest term of any president in history, the first being William Henry Harrison, our nation's 9th president. The 20th president would have a funeral procession, including a piece offered and composed by the famous John Philip Sousa. Scott, that might be something that resonates with you. More than 70,000 well-wishers would pass by the president's casket during his lying in state. His interment was actually held 9 years later when President Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and the future President William McKinley would be in attendance to celebrate the late president's life. So what is it about President Garfield and his faith and public life that made it so compelling, so interesting, so important? President Garfield was a member of the Disciples of Christ, also known as the Christian Church. It was a church formed over a disagreement over denominationalism in the early 1800s. This denomination thought that there were too many denominations and there needed to be a denomination to discuss this denominationalism. Garfield was a lay preacher, and due to that, he preached at the time of this recording again. There might become a preacher president sometime soon or something like that, not me, but others maybe. And due to that, he preached more sermons than any other president in our history. Much akin to our modern day President Carter, he worked hard to have a robust faith that mixed public and private piety. Many of his convictions surrounding enslavement of Africans on this continent were due to his faith and praxis therein. He believed in the equality of the human condition, and that equality was based in his faith. So much so that there were times that he would be asked to go and visit with officials from his denomination who believed in slavery, and he would choose not to because he had that much of an ardent disagreement about the faithful condition of what was required of them in that moment during the American Civil War. His convictions also led to the alignment with the Disciples of Christ and their inner workings surrounding slavery. He was ardently abolitionist, one of our most ardent abolitionist presidents, and that led to his belief in equality, in equity, and in justice for those who had been previously enslaved. That said, he also tragically had to reckon with many deaths in his close family, including children that we mentioned above. While his conclusions often weren't theologically sound, suggesting that he should have been fighting a war rather than being in the House of Representatives, and that's why God was punishing him, they were based in theological underpinnings. He had a sense that God was up to something, even if he was wrong about what God was up to. And that attribution of divine will in the deaths of young children or other family members is something that we kind of hold back from today, but was something that would have been normal in the faith praxis of many people during that time. So yeah, that's all we've got about James Garfield. Scott, what questions do you have that rise to the surface about this president, this 20th president of the United States?
So I have one statement and saying that John Philip Sousa piece is just like so Philip Sousa that it's not even funny. So listen to it. It's actually very interesting. Like that it didn't really strike me as a funeral march at all, or in memoriam, I guess. Um, so the other thing is the other thing I'm gonna start out with is what is the Disciples of Christ Church or anything like that? And can you give me the history of like the what exactly started it? Is it just Christian church or exactly what went into that?
So the Christian church is what they're called, and they are disciples of Christ. Grew out of movements seeking Christian unity. They sensed that there were too many things going on. Um, they thought this actually came about in a conversation over the celebration of the Lord's Supper, or communion, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. They said that people were not celebrating the Lord's Supper together because they were different denominations, and we still have that to some extent today, with some denominations denying others or non-adherence to that of the Lord's table. So these people got together and said, hey, that's not how this should be. Christ's table, as many denominations should be believed, and now believe it even now, should be for all people. They believed that this idea that they were not going to be Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterians. They were trying to literally be just Christians at the base level. And a lot of that meant them taking away some of the things that were the trappings of denominationalism at the time, including the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, the dangers of that, the bishops, the prelates, the archdeacons, those things you will not see in the disciples of Christ. You also see a real sense of ecumenicism, the idea that we're in this together, we're working together, and we're wanting to be part of God's coming kingdom. And so that means that they have a long history of participating with other churches, other religions, other denominations, in a sense of coming together for the sake of the brighter future. It is interesting. There have been at least two presidents, some argue three, that were disciples of Christ or part of the Christian church. James Garfield, of course, was our first disciples president. He would have been probably the first anyway, just due to the history of the church and when it started. The second one was our 36th president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who attended National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C., and his funeral was held there in 1973. And the other is that Ronald Reagan kind of has some history with the Disciples of Christ, and he does. I mean, fairness, he does. Whether he considers himself Disciples of Christ as a president is far less likely. However, he was raised as a young person who was by parents who were by his mother, who was a devout member of the Christian church, the Disciples of Christ. So again, there's some rich history there, but it's large part due to the fact that they are trying to come together in a series of moments that are not as united as they should be.
What was the religious landscape? Are we in the Great Awakening, or what the heck's going on with all this theology junk?
Well, that's a really good question. You could argue that the disciples of Christ and they were born within the scope of the Second Great Awakening. I think it's also fair to say that the disciples of Christ were not a coming together of denominations, but rather of coming together of people within disparate denominations wanting to be united. There are founders and leaders in the disciples who came from Presbyterian, from Baptist backgrounds, who come together and say, hey, we've got to do more to be together in this moment of polarity and lack of unity. And so I think that's what you see there.
My next question is, why him? Out of all the other presidents, I feel like Garfield, other than being named after a famous comic strip, I feel like why him? You know?
That's a really good question. And I actually thought about this. There are presidents that have accomplished far more policy-wise, and Garfield is a great comic strip. That I think it would probably be the other way around, that Garfield was named after President Garfield, but we'll see. All that's to say, is that this man, during his time in office, came in at a time in which his radical republicanism could have easily gotten him sniffed out of the even election. Like he, probably shouldn't have even assumed office. And yet his ability to bring people together, to build consensus, to lead the country, even in the House of Representatives, far outweighs his presidency, but it's still something that should be considered and really celebrated. So for me, President Garfield is really interesting. I loved reading that book again by C.W. Goodyear. We'll link that in the notes. But all that's to say is that book really caused me to take a second look at President Garfield. And something that I think that we should all do at some point is take a second look at our preconceived notions about the people who have served in this office and what they have done. President James A. Garfield's administration had little time to change the course of the ship of state. It was argued that he would steer down the canal. Yet his influence during the time in the House of Representatives and as a decorated war hero endear his legacy to many, including me. Not many of his time had the courage to face down chattel slavery as James Garfield did. Indeed, the pressing issue of his time and beyond. That reality will outlay many others when the scales are measured. Add that with his character, and his desire for substantive reform created a legend of a president, even if the presidency was really, really short. Sometimes the shortened realities lead us to pressing truths, which I think is really important even in our day and age. Next up on our journey, though, through the American presidency, we will explore the presidency that encompassed the turn of the 20th century. We will reach the 20th century with our next president, President William McKinley. He was our 25th president who would have a longer tenure than that of President Garfield, yet he too would become the third president in 4 decades to succumb to an assassin's bullet. His death, President McKinley's death, would enact lasting change on the American presidency and establish the precedent of the United States Secret Service protecting the President of the United States. But we'll talk about all that and more on the next time of So Help Me Pod. And Scott had a great idea that we play off with John Philip Sousa's In Memoriam, the piece that sounds so like John Philip Sousa, right, Scott? But it's supposed to be a mourning piece.
You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.